So, Lane, I've mentioned that I'm really reconsidering where I think the ancient city of Enoch was. I think it was where Sodom was, rather than Uruk. And there's another place I've changed my mind on, and that's the location of the tower.
Really?
Yeah, I think it may have been in a different place. And there's reasons. The first clue is that when you read Genesis 11 in the Septuagint, you'll notice that they translate Babel confound. They translate it properly. And so this place was called the confounding. They deliberately use a literal Greek translation there, and they don't call it Babylon. And just over in chapter 10, you do have a reference to Babylon, one of the cities of Nimrod, and they translate it Babylon. If you look in the Hebrew, it's the same expression, but when you look at the priests, how they're translating, they're making decisions here. And the issue that comes out is this name Babel that was designated for the place where the tower was, it was a nickname. It's not a reference to a city where it was. It's a nickname for that place where that happened, the place of the confounding. And it doesn't necessarily have to be Babylon. And there's other reasons to think this as well. And something that people don't know about is that there were a lot of ziggurats. There were actually a lot of ziggurats. And the ancient kings of Assyria and Babylon were very enthusiastic about preserving and rebuilding these precious holy places where these temples of the gods were. And it's hard for me to explain, but hopefully, let me put it this way. Nebuchadnezzar built his tower on the foundation of an older tower. And this can be evidence that the Tower of Babel was there. It means a sacred place was there. And Nebuchadnezzar he basically rebuilt a temple there, a ziggurat. But that's not the only place where that happened. And I'm telling the truth about these ancient kings too. And I have this book here, and he's talking about some cuneiform fragments that were discovered in the late 1800s. And it's just absolutely fascinating stuff, okay? And basically, let me read this to you. The great rebuilder of ancient temples among the Babylonian monarchs was the last of the latter, namely Nabonidus. In his work of restoration, he more than once came upon the records of ancient sovereigns, which he carefully restored to their place. Thus, in describing the repairs which he executed at the ancient temple of the sun, which had not only fallen into ruin, but had actually been buried under a covering of dust, like that which conceals the ruined edifices of Babylonia at the present day, Nabonidus tells us that he found records of Burnaburiyesh and of Hammurabi. And this is all very true. And these ancient kings would bury cylinders and tablets at the foundations of important structures, temples, palaces, and preserving records was very important to them. And they knew that kings before them had stored records in the foundations of buildings. This is how knowledge was passed along. Nabonidus tells us he found these records. Here's what he says. I beheld within it the written name of Hammurabi, the old king, who, 700 years before Burnaburiyesh, had erected the temple of the sun and the tower upon the old foundation. You see how they are rebuilding ziggurats on the foundation of earlier sacred sites. This is a quote from the king.
That's a pretty neat finding there.
Yeah. And he's a real serious king and a real important guy. And the things he's saying here sound
stupid,
fairy tale-like, but it's true. They stored records in the foundations of their precious buildings, and they knew that each other did that, and they knew that generations before them going way back did that, and they were keen on getting their hands on those records and keeping their records. Very much so. It's very true. Okay. He goes on to say, from this passage, the date of Hammurabi is fixed at BC 2200, which is not our standard view. It's not the common view. It's out of sync. In a temple at Sippara, Nabonidus found inscriptions of... Before I move on, the fact that Nabonidus's records mention this is tremendous. It means this is possibly correct. But this is not the date we ascribe to Hammurabi. In a temple at Sippara, Nabonidus found inscriptions of Shagashautayesh, who, he says, reigned 800 years before. These inscriptions had been vainly sought for by Esarhaddon and Nebuchadnezzar. Nabonidus carefully restored them to their place in company with his own records. Among the remains of the staged tower at Ur, Nabonidus found inscriptions of Dungi, the ancient king of that city. In the city of Harran, In the city of Harran, Nabonidus rebuilt a temple which had formerly been restored by Sardanapalus. The later king had, so Nabonidus tells us, found there the buried cylinder of Shalmaneser II. This is actually Shalmaneser III, if people want to look into this. I don't know if there's different reckonings. I don't know, but if you want to look this guy up at Google, it's Shalmaneser III. Nabonidus tells us the following. I summoned men from all parts, from Gaza, on the borders of Egypt, on the upper sea beyond the Euphrates, to the lower sea. The kings, princes, governors, and men from all parts, whom the moon god and the sun god, my lords, and the goddess Ishtar, my lady, had subjected to me, to build Ekhulkhul, the house of the moon god, my lord and helper, which stands in the city of Harran, and which Sardanapalus, king of Assyria, son of Esarhaddon, king of Assyria, the prince who preceded me, had built. In a favorable month, on the appointed day which the sun god and Rimmon had announced to me in a dream, I laid the foundation of the temple and built up its brickwork in the wisdom of Ea and Merodach, with incantations, with the art of the brick god, the lord of foundation stones and of bricks, with joy and exultation, upon the inscribed foundations of Sardanapalus, king of Assyria, who had discovered here the inscribed foundations of Shalmaneser, son of Ashurnasirpal. With palm wine, grape wine, oil, and honey I sprinkled the walls. More than the kings my fathers, I strengthened its walls and adorned its structure. So here he is restoring the temple of the moon god in Harran. This temple, Ekhulkhul. The word tower isn't used in this particular fragment, but there was a ziggurat at Harran. What I think, Lane, is that instead of venturing now, I violated the pattern of Cain going over to where they were in captivity. And I'm about to violate the pattern again. I used to think that pattern existed. Cain left here, hooked around, went down here. The Tower of Babel was down here. Abraham was called from down here up to Harran, and then he comes down here. When the children of Israel go into captivity, they end up over here. I had seen this pattern emerging, and I always follow patterns. That's how you unlock things. It's the key. So I always follow patterns. But maybe there's just not a pattern here. Maybe I'm seeing a ghost pattern. Because I think Cain left Jerusalem and built his city down here. And then after the flood, and of course Noah's Ark landed on Mount Zion. If people don't know about that, I made a video on that. And so when I haven't gotten into chapter 9 and I don't have time, but Ham does what he does, things go wrong, he's cursed. So he leaves, he and his people with him. They're the ones journeying, they're the ones that go journeying in the east. They depart once again. But I think they only went as far as this plain in Shinar, which is essentially the land between the rivers. It's Mesopotamia. I think this could be the plain they came across as they left. And I think they built the tower at Harran. And there is an ancient Muslim mosque. You can see the outline here. This area right here, we know, is where the ancient temple to the moon god Sin, that's that god's name. His name is Sin. The temple to the moon god Sin sat right here, and we know it. You know how we know? Archaeologists were digging around this mosque, digging underneath, and they found ancient Babylonian inscriptions. And so this is the likely spot. Right here is where this temple to the moon god was. That's why a mosque was built here much later on to supersede the purpose of the site. But this outline here, I know there's a bigger square that you can see here. I don't think the ziggurat was that big. That would be a huge thing. I think the outline's right about here. This is where the mosque was. And the outline of the very ancient ziggurat would be right here. And so this is a very ancient sacred site that was rebuilt again and again. And so it is possibly a Tower of Babel site. I think the tower was here in Harran. And I think Abraham likely came from Sanliurfa. Why? Because the Muslims say so. They are right so often about these kinds of things that when the Muslim tradition suggests something, you should at least give it a listen and hear, because they're right a lot. They would tell you Abram's from this ore right here, and that his initial leg of his journey with his father was to Harran here. It's much less a journey for the initial part, and then Abram eventually would have left and went into Canaan indeed. And later, when Abraham sends his servant to find a son for Isaac, if you follow the path that servant takes, he comes up and crosses the Euphrates and comes into Abraham's hometown and to find a wife for Isaac. And it's just interesting. This was his hometown for a long time, and there's nothing wrong with that narrative. But if he comes from Sanliurfa, then this really is his hometown, you know. But that is what I think. The Tower of Babel was at Harran. the site in Babel is also very likely, and I keep it open as an option. Archaeologically, Babel would line up fine with my timeline. And this again is a spot that was built and rebuilt and rebuilt and rebuilt. And Alexander tore down the tower in his time with the intention of rebuilding it. But it never happened, and it sits like this today. It's amazing. Ancient ziggurat site. Could be Tower of Babel. That's my second option. So, if what I'm saying is true, then all of the biblical accounts occur within this area. And the vast majority of it is right in here. This out to Harran would be the furthest if the people of Genesis 11, Ham and his descendants, Canaan with them, if they journeyed up to this plain in Shinar, that's the furthest location from the main area where all the rest of the events happen. In Genesis 1 to Genesis 2 to 11. I think if you have a tighter region where everything occurs, then it's making better sense.
That was something I was going to say. It seems like more and more as you dig through this, you're finding that everything is taking place in a more and more centralized location.
Yeah.
You found the garden is not located in some fertile crescent, it's located here in the ancient land here. You found that the Noah's Ark land on Mount Zion. All this stuff is happening more in this central location. Everything's getting closer to this original land.
Yeah.
And obviously Haran is not it's still quite a ways off, but at least it's more centrally located. I mean, obviously if Babylon's located more towards the east here, that is a long track, but I suppose it's possible. I don't know how long it would take to travel, but I'm sure a long time. But to have all these significant events occur.
Well, the Israelites made the trek in captivity. So it's not out of the question. This gets rid of that leg of the trek, though, for Abram, like you said, and it tightens up the story then. So the people leave and go here. And then when the curtain opens and God calls out Abram, he has him coming right where the tower was. And from there they head back to a land he will show him. And so there's just a tighter connection that way. There's less confusion or of the Chaldees. Why would God pick a guy from down there? I mean, it doesn't matter, but there's just less confusion now. Altogether. It's interesting that if God would have Abram drawn out of Haran, this is the same region Balaam came from. And the people of Midian went and called on Balaam to come curse Israel. He made a journey down there for that. Now that was my my big one though, man. Now in these quotes he goes on, okay, another temple restored. Here he's talking about tearing down an old temple. He found the records. And they come from Naram-Sin. That's Nimrod's grandson that extended the kingdom into Assyria. It says, from then he went into Asher. I should look at that verse. Well, I'm keeping you up too late. You have work tomorrow. I'll wrap this one up here, man.
Well, how late do you stay up? Or how late are you willing to stay up?
You want to keep talking about this a little?
I'm the invisible man. I'm the invisible man. It's criminal how I can.
Okay. This is an article on Harran. The walls, it was a city with walls. Unfortunately, what we have today, it's hard to tell. It's been rebuilt over and over. There's Greek and Roman portions and so forth. It's hard to tell really what we're working with, if there's any original wall left and so forth. But it was, of course, a walled city. And remember how I told you Muslim historians tend to get things right? They have a good track record.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Hamad al-Harrani, a medieval Islamic scholar in a work now lost, says that Harran was the first city founded after the Great Flood. So what he's saying in Genesis 11, that group that left and built a city, it was Harran. The Muslims know all about all this stuff already. Nothing new from Bruno here. So it's kind of interesting. And that's the funny thing. Masons know about this too, but just because they pay attention to the Muslims. Hey, when the Muslims say something, it's usually right. They have tradition, history. When they say such and such happened here, they tend to be right. And that's why I think Noah's Ark landed on Mount Zion. But Muslims, the Muslim tradition is it landed on Mount Qudi or Judy along the mountain ridge along Armenia. And because the Muslims say that, I'll leave that open as a possibility. But I think it landed at Mount Zion. So, yep.
Good stuff, man. Well, I'm glad I stuck around, though. That was some pretty cool stuff.
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate it. I have you up way too late.
And as always, it's always good to hear from you and hear what you're studying. All good food for thought and stuff, so
Thanks,
that's good.
man.
Well, just in case we have a good discussion today, for anybody listening, please like the video. If you find it interesting, please like and subscribe for more content related to this.
Hey folks, comment below.
Yeah, really.
We want to hear your comments.